All right, chapters 4 through 6, which I came just bursting with enthusiasm to talk about. Last week, I had some apprehensions about the conversation and how much we would actually have to say about it and how much time it would take for us to discuss it. And in the chapters 4 through 6, I completely fell for this novel. I love it. I love reflecting on what I love about it. I love reflecting on what impact I think it's having on my soul and personality, or could potentially have. So I feel like there's a lot to talk about. And also, I just thought so much was hysterically funny. I especially liked chapter 4. So it just, for the sheer entertainment value of it, I was totally sold. A couple of things before we get started. First thing I want to say is, don't be afraid to correct me in these conversations. I know I'm leading the group, but I have no shame about making mistakes. And I forget what it was, but I did realize, it was about the bookmark and the motivation of the person who read only for the joy of seeing the letters come together as words, and then the bookmark that was always in the same place. I think I treated those as the same character, and they weren't the same character. But in any case, and also Ray's Raskolnikov reference went right over my head, but he did correct me in the moment, so that was fine. But anyway, open invitation to correct me when I make a mistake, because it will happen. I have confessed to how terrible my memory is. It's something I'm very self-aware about. Okay, that's all. I think we can get started. It looks like Wendy may have a preliminary comment before I get into the substance of things.
Okay, I had a thought as I was reading, because I did hit a couple points where I thought were so funny. And I was remembering your problem of how do you talk about comedy without it kind of killing it. I wondered if maybe we could put in the chat, put favorite quote, what you thought was the funniest favorite moment. Because for me, it wasn't chapter 4. It was Sobokovich, is that how you say him? The bear guy. But it's not just the bear guy. There's a particular part where I thought it was kind of funny, and then it was like a laugh out loud hilarious. So I thought that might be fun, even like to try to come up with our top 3. What were the best, funniest, by people putting in their
That sounds like a great idea. Maybe we could do that next week, so we can give everybody an opportunity to select their, Grace and I, we had, it can be a variation on the chapter title thing we used to do. We could do that here too. Sobakevich.
Oh, that would be fun, because these are all like little episodes in like an ongoing show. We could like name each episode.
Name the episode. There you go. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I like that idea. Although it would be extraordinarily difficult for me to choose from these last 3 chapters. Oh my gosh. I think the moment that I laughed out loud the hardest, I mean, just driving in my car uninhibitedly burst out laughing out loud, which is not I'll chuckle kind of inside of myself, but I laughed out loud, was the last line of this section we read.
It was so funny. Oh my gosh.
To refresh your memory, if you're not conscious of what the last line was, it was something like the peaceful sleep of those who are not troubled by physical ailments or an overly developed intellect. I just laughed so hard. Okay, well, let's go into, if Grace, you're coming in fresh, so I should give you a chance to speak first. Do you want to say anything about your experience reading it? And I could maybe briefly summarize what we talked about last week too.
I don't know that I have a whole lot to say, and I admittedly feel a little bit awkward. I really wanted to listen to that recording before I came this morning. I was ill last week and have then been playing catch up for a week. But I just want to say that I do find this immensely hilarious. And earlier in the week, Lisa texted me to say that this is like What were your exact words? I don't want to butcher them. It was really
I think
fun.
I just said it's the office of Russian literature.
Yes, it's
I don't know
the
if anyone
office
here
of
watches The
Russian
Office.
literature. And I was like, oh, that's really funny. And I hadn't done the reading for this section yet. So then I started reading, and I texted Lisa yesterday. I was like, I got your text message before I met Todd Packer. I mean, Nozdryov, or however you pronounce his name.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with that. I do think it's exactly that way. So I'm excited about talking about it with you guys. And I feel sad that I missed last week.
Yeah. Well, last week, it was fun and fascinating, our conversation last week, because a lot of it was about what is kind of the overall focus and purpose of the book. Is it,
which is hard.
And it's hard to know. Obviously, we haven't finished it, so we have to reserve judgment until we have. And we don't even know why he's going around collecting souls. One of the things that I found particularly fascinating about these chapters was that my number one, my leading theory about why he was collecting them, which was for social status for social status as opposed for any monetary reason, was a lie, a lie. So that one was discredited. And then he says, comes up with the excuse that he is going to be married, and her parents require that he have a certain number of souls, and that one is also a lie. So I'm left thinking, okay, well, I really have no idea why he's doing this.
Yeah, same.
And
I had those two theories were my top theories as well. And then in that chapter this week, it was like, no, that's not it.
Known. I think Gogol must have known that that's what you were going to be thinking. And I've scrupulously avoided reading anything about this book so that I don't know.
Yeah, same. I have no clue.
Okay, so that's where we're left with that. So yeah, what we came around to was that humor was, well, what I came around to, and there seemed to be some amount of agreement, is that humor is the leading goal of this book, not in a kind of vacuous way, but just the humor is by its nature social commentary, but that he is a writer who looks at the world from the perspective of what kind of fascinates and amuses him about it. And so that seems to be kind of guiding the tone and narration of the book. Ray.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, last week you said that the book is a little bit like an SNL skit where they're having to re-explain the premise every time they run into a character. And one thing I realized is it's actually structured a bit like Ideal. You know, Ayn Rand's play Ideal, because like, oh, you have all these different characters who like, oh, here's this sort of odd situation they're confronted with, and we see how they react each time. In this case, it's much funnier this time in this context, but yeah, but I really, I guess is what I love about Gogol, especially after having done Flaubert, is just he's a human being who feels. Like I just like there's that one little line, well, not a little line, probably like a paragraph, where they just mention like some servant comes in and grabs and drops off the food, and he just says that, you know, most people just think of those people as furniture, but if you go to the servants' quarters, it's quite a different story with their own human life. And it's like, okay, you care, and there's another like contrast for me of like, oh, here's someone who actually feels with people. Is well, we'll talk about chapter 6 in a bit, but you know, that old man who's just he's almost spiritually anesthetized. Like he has nothing inside of him anymore. It's almost all dropped away. But there's still a sense of him like relating to him. And he's almost like a sort of avaricious character that wouldn't feel too out of place in a Flaubert novel. And it's like, oh, but he's still relating to him. He's
treats him very differently.
Some human experience. But anyway,
no, that's one thing. I'll save it for. We'll go in order and take on our characters one at a time. But that is one of my questions for that chapter. Is I felt like there was a change of tone, a pretty substantial change of tone in that chapter, and that just interested me. Why that was the case, because I felt like that character was really grotesque in so many ways. The image of him with the snuff poking out of his nostril, and his undergarments showing. I mean, he was grotesque and yet very sympathetic at the same time. I mean, his backstory was told in a sympathetic way, and there was plenty of humor in chapter 6, but I feel like the humor almost was reserved to the end of the chapter, and the presentation of his character and the description of the home seemed not as focused on drawing the humor out of it always as the other chapters. Anyway, let's wait on him and start with our friend Nozdryov and his brother-in-law, the fair man and the dark man and the fair man. So it was the dark man and the fair man, Nozdryov and his brother-in-law, that made The Office pop into my head, because I thought the brother-in-law was the funniest character in these chapters. For some reason, every time he said, "That's not true," like in his passive, exasperated, but also weak and utterly helpless way. Like he's always going to be the loser here, and he's always going to be in the background, and nobody's going to be listening to him. They're going to be focused on the guy with all the bluster. But he just keeps like throwing that out, you didn't pay $10,000. You didn't drink 17 bottles of champagne. And I was thinking, what does that remind me of? And what popped into my head was actually, I'm sorry, I'm so bad at names. The Steve Carell's character in The Office, and the guy, the human resources guy, Toby, I'm sorry if people don't watch The Office and this is lost on you. And it's not that their relationship is identical, but that phenomenon of him just kind of passively, helplessly sitting there going, "That's not true." That's what it made me think of.
That's absolutely right.
Okay. So anyway, what I will let other people share. I know Ray has a definite opinion on the nature of Nozdryov, but there was that scene where the narrator says, "You might think these Nozdryovs don't exist today," or something to that effect, but just because he's wearing a different coat doesn't mean it's a different man. And I, reading this character, felt like, oh yeah, I know that type. I definitely know that 100%. Type. Defining exactly what it is challenging, which is part of what's so entertaining and fascinating about Gogol's presentation of him. But I definitely feel like I know that type. Okay, so what is that type? Anybody want to share a thought? Ray?
Well, Trump. I did. I mean, I just couldn't help but just see it that way. Like just the little irrelevant lies and that sort of boisterous familiarity, and the way he can be lying about you as an enemy and then friendly at another moment. It was just, I don't want to make this political. Yeah. I'll stop. But just on a personality level, it was just indistinguishable, even down to the chess game or the droughts game or whatever that was. Mm-hmm. It was perfect. But yeah, Nozdryov is the kind of guy who I just want to hit in the face with a shovel. He's just an insufferable liar, who doesn't understand what reality is.
So let's try to draw out some of his characteristics. So one of the moments that I thought captured him so well was when they first come into the inn, and the brother-in-law, it says something to the effect that, the brother-in-law might be a guy that you'd talk to and, and get into a good conversation, except then Nozdryov busts in and kind of takes over the room with his he has a vitality to him that is part this kind of charming it's not, I don't know if that's the right way to, charismatic personality, and also absolute immaturity. So he can, capture your attention, but then you're going to be fighting a few hours later. There's going to be some bitter dispute between you. So he captures everybody's attention, but he has this, I don't know, he's a pleasure seeker, he's a storyteller, he's kind of full of himself. He's very loud, he flits from one thing to another. Another of the moments that really captured so I felt like got to the essence of his soul is when he was like, bring in the puppy. Look at this puppy. This is just such an amazing puppy. Look at his coat, and like making a big deal about it. And he's like, I've always wanted one of these. And then the next breath was, take him away. Like, get him out of here now. And like, that's how long his attachment to and interest in anything seems to last. So then later there was a comment about his personality wasn't even changed by marriage, and that his wife gave him 2 children and he just wasn't very interested in them. And I thought, oh, just like the puppy, like he probably was interested for a moment, and he's like, okay, now get them out of there. And then they were raised by the nurse. Any other observations on Nozdryov? Boastful, exaggerating. Oh yeah, that's were some of the best.
I've seen this bluster like in my goings about in the world. Like you've seen, even if it's not every aspect of him, the essential aspects are definitely present in the world, even if he's wearing a different coat, as you said.
Yeah. Well, one of the lines we talked about, so I called this in my notes the eccentrically proverbial characters, because I read that all of these characters became proverbial in Russian culture. Like everybody knew who these characters were, and they stood for a certain type, but at the same time they have all these very specific personal eccentricities that are not exactly relevant to the type, but make the type so entertaining and real and concrete. So that's
why I was like, he's Todd Packer from The Office.
Yes. So there's those essential characters that are familiar, but then there is the particular coat that he's wearing that makes him a specific character. Ray.
Yeah, I guess the way I think of him is just being like boisterously hedonistic. It's like the only kind of value that exists in his life is just sort of an immediate pleasure, where it's like the idea of like being truthful, like that's just not something in his dimension. Like that's not a relevant thing. The same thing with the idea of not just beating up a guy for not finishing a game of chess with you. Like that's just I feel like it. I'm just gonna have this temper tantrum, I'm gonna go berserk. And the hedonism I want to actually stress because of just the superficiality of the emotion of it's like he can be telling poisonous he can be very good friends with you at one moment, telling poisonous lies the next, and then he goes back. So it's like there's nothing substantial underneath the surface. It's just whatever sort of fits the moment.
The thing that the thing that's a little elusive to me that I want to include in here is that there's something given to him that lets him get away with this as long as he does. So charisma is how I described it. When he's introduced, it says he enters the room ruffling his dark hair. So even it might just be his physical presence in part. He's ruffling his dark hair. He's as fresh as milk and roses and bursting with health. So there's something he possesses that gets him in and then there was a description of, he gets into so many fights that his whiskers are always pulled out from some physical scrap, but they grow back really quickly. So there's some vitality in him that's letting him for now come back from all of these things, but it won't last. But it's, what is that quality?
Well, I think it's like he's a hedonist and he really gets pleasure out of stuff on some level, at least on that basic level, and that's what gets him going. That's what drives him. Is like, I'm just gonna have another one.
Mhm.
And well, I just have to. I'm sorry. I just have to make the comparison though. Is like that is just so Trump. Like Trump has this unlimited energy. Like you should. Like his campaign schedule is absolutely insane. And he's in his 70s, for Christ's sake. But you
Mhm.
know, so
Mhm.
I do think like these two are brothers.
So it's I'm going to stay away from the politics completely, but you're saying it's the thriving. I mean, he seems to thrill in, um, telling his stories and having an audience and negotiating for negotiating for the game of it. Everything is the pleasure contained within the pleasure he can find within the activity. And it's never about the object or the goal. All the things he possesses, his horses, his barrel organ, his dogs, none of them mean anything to them. It's like the thrill of the chase or the bargain or the game or whatever. So yeah, I guess being a pleasure seeker is part of it, but then also just having this kind of youthful vitality that allows you to get into all of these situations and find
Well,
pleasure in them.
I mean, there's a certain appeal to someone who's just so, I guess you'd almost say, in the moment of just, I'm getting the pleasure now.
Mhm.
Like it just rolls properly for him.
Mhm.
That
And he
is,
also just seizes it. I mean,
yeah,
he just commands it.
yeah. Like there's a certain superficial confidence and brashness and
Brashness.
straightforwardness about it, which
Yeah.
makes it appealing, at least for I mean, I would hate to, as you know, my opinion of what if I met this sort of person, how I'd
Mhm.
feel. But there are other people, it's like, no, that's very charismatic
Mhm.
on a
Mhm.
superficial level.
Yeah.
Stefan.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't think it's pleasure seeking or hedonism really, and kind of what you were saying, Lisa. It's more about the game, more about the chase, more about just interacting with things and just pushing their buttons and just seeing what he can get out of people. You know, it's more of just let's just see what happens. Kind of more of just someone maybe I don't even want to say a nihilist because there's definitely a better word, but yeah, just somebody who's like riding the wave and just let's see what's around the corner and if I have to fight or if I have to get something,
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
the only thing is that makes it sound kind of malicious and nefarious, and he's just an
Yeah,
example.
it's not nihilistic. That's not the right word.
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
wasn't
so
the right word.
I think that's true what you're saying, but it does seem like it's just the thrill within each of those activities that he's seeking. It's
Right, like
some kind of
let's have a
entertainment.
dinner and then maybe a fight afterwards. You know what I mean? And let's just like I don't know. It's crazy, and I feel really uncomfortable around those types of people.
Mhm.
So
Okay.
Shoshana.
Yeah, I think when Ray said that he's in the moment, that was something I was going to say, but there's
Mhm.
something that follows from that, because if he's in the moment, he's also someone who's not living in a plot. You know, he's not building things.
Yeah.
And for him, and that's why it's so funny that he's got the built-in denier of the brother-in-law who says, well, that's not true. And he doesn't care. Okay.
He just keeps
Because-
going.
Yeah, he doesn't care because reality for him is, you know, he pushes a reset and yeah, that's true. And it's very uncomfortable to deal with people like that because the rest of us are living in a continuous reality in which you can't just change what happened yesterday or what you said 5 minutes ago. But I almost also picture him as like one of those, I don't know, dolls that you knock it over and it's right
I was
back in
thinking the
place.
same thing.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Totally.
and of course there's something amusing about it, except that if you have to interact with such a person, it's very disquieting because the rest of us, well, like say if you, I don't know, someone makes you a promise and you think it means something. No, you believe that? No. You know, or tries to make you think that the promise wasn't made, or you shouldn't have planned on this, or it's your mistake. And for
Yeah.
him, yeah,
Well,
okay.
I
He's
thought
never
it was.
wrong. He's never wrong. He's never sorry. But
Mhm.
it's also, you can't necessarily get ahead of him and figure out exactly what he wants. Because if you could do that, that would be a kind of stability,
Mhm.
which he doesn't have. Anyway,
Right.
that's what it's also, I think, why he's eternal, because he can't change, except that he changes every instant, but he can't fundamentally change.
Right, because there's
He
nothing
can't-
constant to change.
Yeah,
Well, it's funny because when Chichikov leaves his house, he's looking over his shoulder the whole time, feeling fearful of him. So he's not a joke to even to Chichikov. He's afraid of him.
Mhm.
Um,
It's uncomfortable to deal with people like that. Like
yeah.
when you realize that you're in the room with someone like that, it doesn't feel quite safe. Like you're kind of like, oh, okay. Like,
Yeah. Anyone want to say anything about the brother-in-law though? Before we go on though.
There are a
so
few comments in the
one of
chat
the-
too, by the way.
Okay, yeah, I am actually watching them this time. One of the comedic devices is callbacks, right? And every once in a while we'll have a callback in this book that also cracks me up. I don't know if that's the appropriate term to use here, but when he got to the horse that was not even a very nice horse, and he claimed he spent 10,000 rubles on it, and the brother-in-law is like, no, you didn't. You know, it was another one of those moments. And then later when they're negotiating over the souls, he offers to throw in the horse at a value of 2,000 rubles because, you know, I paid 10,000 for it. And oh my gosh, just bringing that back in that moment was so hysterically funny, because like it's a given now because I said earlier that it was 10,000. So now we can negotiate the price from my arbitrary number that I gave you before. Stefan.
Sorry, my hand was still up. No, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, no problem. So the brother-in-law, it's just like wet blanket is at one point he's called something like a wet blanket, and it feels appropriate because on the one hand we're so much on his side because he's calling him out for his absurd lies, but he does it in such a helpless, passive, almost whiny way is how I read it.
yeah, it's like there's no expectation that it will make any difference, and yet he says it anyway.
Right, but also he can't even leave without Nozdryev's permission,
Right.
and go home to his wife.
Mm-hmm.
He's just so passive.
Oh, and this is not related to what you're talking about, but the description of him talking about it, even though he'd left the room, and he was like, just kind of like looking off into the distance, still talking to Nozdryev about it.
Yeah.
I loved that.
Yeah. Ray?
Yeah, I like the brother-in-law too. I didn't find him as funny for some reason. I guess just because it was just like,
you hated the other.
yeah, it just, I guess it's just frustrating of like, you know, like why haven't you disemboweled this man yet? You know, like I don't get it. But I did find, yeah, just the sheer impotence of him as a character is just, well, it's very Russian. That sort of Hamlet-like, you know, like, okay, here's an actual thoughtful person, but it doesn't do him any good. You know, he's just very. I feel me a little bit like maybe that's a little bit like Gogol on a certain level of like, you know, very intelligent, perceptive, but you know, it's not like he's gonna do anything about it. But anyway.
Oh, I can't. But the thing is, I was set to think of him as entirely humorous by their first conversation because it's so darn funny. When he's like, if only I had 20 rubles in my pocket, I'd win it all back. And he's like, you said the same thing before when I gave you 50 rubles and you lost it. And he's like, I only lost it. And the end of that sentence is basically because I lost it. But he's like, I only lost it because I chose the wrong thing to bet it on. Like, yeah, that's how you lose.
That moment and just so many of the other ones where he's the word is confabulating. You know, it's just he's just finding words that fit his feeling. You know, it doesn't matter. There's no reality testing going on there. It's just an intellect divorced from any sort of empirical testing. It's like that sort of person's just pure poison.
Yeah. But that seems like a very personal reaction. We should see him as poison, but also that scene was really funny. Molly.
Yeah, I'm starting to wonder why Chichikov is putting up with these characters. What is driving him? I mean, he has this straight goal, but then he seems willing to go out into the rain and mud and drive endlessly around and get lost and put up with being beaten. And then he goes on to the next one. I mean, every situation is putting him in peril, even if, I mean, if we take it as a serious thing, these are, you'd really die out there in the mud and rain if you didn't find shelter and you didn't find food for night, and then couldn't get unstuck and had to wander for miles. If you had to walk that, you're out on the steppe. So why is he willing to risk this and put up with these very annoying people? Like, what I mean, we found that out. So every is adding to that sense of suspense of like, what is this? What is so important?
Well, what's interesting to me is how little I found myself asking why.
Yeah.
Because I think I just felt completely.
This guy is so annoying that it's building up to why are we here?
Why are we even doing
It's a completely reasonable question. And there are many moments, including the one that follows, before he gets to Sobakevich, and we have the colliding carriages and the woman with the egg-like face. I mean, I read that scene. I was like, that was a really captivating scene. Why did it just what on earth was that about? So I'll have these moments where I think, like, why did that happen?
What are we doing here?
But mostly I'm so present in the moment of the descriptions that I forget to even ask myself why. And I suppose, I mean, I want to talk at the end about what is the value I've been taking from this book, but I suppose it's because the value I'm taking is in the nature of the descriptions that I find myself not demanding plot in the way I would. Most other work that I read.
Maybe an interesting light on Chichikov's character, that he has all this forbearance of tolerating very bad behaviors in other.
Well, he just adapts to the circumstances for the most part, right? Because he was Mr. Amiable with the amiable guy, and now we have Mr. Contrarian. I cracked up at the parallels of the conversation between him and Sobakevich and him and Manilov. They were like opposites. So instead of he's such a genial man, oh, he's so genial and amiable. Oh, the most amiable man. This time it was he's such an amiable man. He's a complete.
He's terrible. Yeah.
But yeah, okay. So before we get to Sobakevich, do we want to talk about the colliding carriages and the woman with the translucent face? All right, Ray, what you got?
First thing, just on Molly's comment of why he's doing it, is just at the end of chapter 6, we actually see Chichikov just loves it. He loves getting the dead souls. He's just in a state of profound pleasure singing. But we'll get there when we get there.
That's true. When he gets the more than 200, he sings.
Yeah. At 27 kopecks a piece, or whatever it was. But I love that. But but the colliding carriages, I really, that was a moment I could relate to. And we'll talk about why. Because he's looking at this beautiful young woman, who, and the most appealing part of her is the fact that she lacks all qualities which we consider feminine, and just how it's like, yeah, she'll probably be turned into just this horrible bitch in a couple of years by all the aunts and mother-in-laws or whatever they are, and I know. I don't have this thought often, but it has happened to me where I see like a child or a little girl, and I feel like, oh, what a wonderful girl, and I spent time. I remember what girls in high schools were like, and I remember what girls in college were like, and I realized that little girls usually turn into that, and there's a feeling in me of like, ah, I I hope she doesn't turn into that. Hope she doesn't turn into to use the precise word to describe them. I would that language is not appropriate here, but but
So much cynicism. We need, Grace, our next book has to be pure benevolent romanticism. That's
All
it.
right, let's do
but
it.
there is that degree. I do have that thought occasionally. It's like, well, that's not, and it's like, okay, I'm glad.
So
I'm glad
is that why her face looks like an egg? She hasn't even hatched yet.
yeah, like she hasn't yet been horribly distorted and disfigured by the world around her.
Yeah, but it's a weird
that,
perspective to come from Chichikov. It's just, it's a.
well, it's not. I don't know if Chichikov feels that way. It has those thoughts exactly. I think that's in the narrator's voice. Is like, well, that's what makes her appealing. Chichikov doesn't know that.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
But like just that aspect of. But I just love that.
Yeah, I get that idea. But that's kind of like what's appealing about that image on its own terms, how it fits into the greater scheme, if there is a greater scheme, is a separate question and it's not at all clear to me. I mean, it just seems so incidental.
Yeah, it doesn't fit in a broader in the sense of like to the plot or anything, but I do sort of just chalk it up to he's just so interested in human beings. He's interested in just the little worlds they live and like those incidental moments where you just sort of see a woman over there and you have a thought about what she's like and where she's going and the broader trends, or you see a servant walk by and they have their own little world. Yeah. That's why I feel he's not essentially humorous, although is essential to his broader character, but he's more essentially like, I'm just interested in people and all their little bizarre little aspects that are just so endearing.
Yeah. Shoshana.
Yeah, I think that this funny passage is a little bit set up by what comes earlier in the chapter. And this again is one of these things that I just had to stop and laugh at. This is when Chichikov is thinking, say what you like. If the police captain hadn't shown up, I might not have been granted another look at God's world. So he's thinking about death. Oh, serious. I'd have vanished like a bubble on water without a trace, leaving no posterity, providing my future children with neither fortune nor an honest name. Now, here he's worried that he's not going to have any children, and then he's worried that he'd have children, but they wouldn't, those things don't go together. You can't be worried about the fate of your children if you're worried that you're not going to have any children. I mean, we're living in the real world, so we can see this doesn't make sense. But for him, he's kind of thinking, "Oh, gee, my poor children. Oh, I might not even have children." And then the narrator tells us our hero is very much concerned with his posterity. So he's already sort of in this frame of mind of children, and now here comes the carriage, and there's an old lady, and there's a sort of on the cusp of marriageability young girl. And if he's thinking about posterity, he could be thinking about maybe, I should marry this girl. On the other hand, she might end up like the old lady, and that wouldn't be so hot.
Right. And he does regret later not having made an effort to actually communicate with her, right? Or learn about her. Yeah. Yeah.
I just think it's funny that it actually follows that when you think that the joke is done, and then it's sort of as if the joke is turned into the carriage that bumps into him. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. Again, you can really, this book takes a long time to read because you have to stop to laugh.
I know. Yeah. Well, we've got plenty to laugh about with Sovakiewicz. Yeah. Right from the first moment that those two faces appear in the window. One of them looks like a cucumber. can't recall. The other one's round, the other one looks like a cucumber. But yes, so everything about him is coarse and bear-like, coarse, heavy, clumsy, bear-like, everything about him and all the furniture in his house. But this has to be one of the best descriptions of a person's face I've ever read. One stroke of the axe and there's a nose, another, and there are the lips. The eyes are bored with a great drill, and without polishing it off, nature thrusts it into the world saying, this'll do. There you go. That'll do.
Oh my gosh. It's so good.
So he's, I mean, Sobakevich, I don't know, how do you capture him? He's a big, clumsy, oaf-like bear. And he's a contrarian, doesn't he? Just wants to argue for the sake and negotiate for the sake of negotiating, but not for the game of it, for the contrarian, just to be.
He just wants to disagree.
Wants to disagree.
Which, like, I don't know, like if you imagine what that would look like in the real world, it doesn't look completely opposite from someone like Nozdryov, but it's also very different. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't. It's, well, let's see. What are the things that make, so there's the furniture, he steps on people's feet a lot because he's clumsy. His whole, oh my gosh, his whole bargaining is just, let's see. There weren't a lot of moments to capture him. It was more just,
he was more of a vibe.
A description, a vibe, yeah. Right?
Yeah, I just know that kind of mental state a little bit of what he's just that contrarianism of just like always finding fault and always being upset and always just like just twisting it the other way, looking for a defect. I just known people like that. This isn't a personal relationship. He's not Rudolph after all, but yeah, I didn't actually have to say, but I found him less interesting than Nozdryov or Plushkin as a character. Just he is very well he's very well drawn, not well cut, but but yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I have far fewer notes on him than I do the other characters. So I had the same reaction. I found him very entertaining and memorable as a type. But I think my two favorite moments, well, one of them has to do with his wife, the cucumber face. So this is where I want to pause and say part of what I love about this book. For people who don't know, my mutual friend with Grace, Jeremiah Cobra, this may not mean as much, but he has this thing he says a lot where you'll tell him something humorous or you'll tell him a story or something and he'll go, that's funny. Or he'll tell you about something and he'll go, that's funny. And there's something so satisfying about his that's funny. It's almost like the fact that he's not laughing, he's like observing as an aficionado. That's what it feels like. And there's a real sense of
judgment on whether or not it's funny. Yeah.
And there's a real sense of satisfaction in him when he says it. You can feel it. Like he's really getting enjoyment from it, but he's getting enjoyment from the intellectual identification that's really funny.
Yeah.
So I just sort of imagine Gogol going through life, observing things and then going, that's funny.
That's funny.
So
that is such an excellent comparison. Oh my gosh.
The moment that made me think of that here was the moment that the wife's hands smelled like she had washed them in cucumber water. Now her face had already been described as looking like a cucumber, and now her hands smell like cucumber water. I just imagine Gogol having an experience like that and going,
That's funny.
that's funny. So in terms of kind of takeaways in general from the book, I do want to cultivate that part of my soul where I'm walking through life, observing things and going, that's funny. I'm going to get delight out of the fact that that's an amusing juxtaposition. Shoshana.
I think this is also something you could cultivate, the description of Chichikov looks around the room and everything looks like Savakevich.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
That's funny.
The table, the chairs, the armchairs, every object is saying, I too am Savakevich.
Yeah.
And it's a real thing. Sometimes it's as if a person defines a whole environment, but literally everything around would look like this bear. That's funny.
Yeah, that is funny. It's like people say that people often look like their dogs. I'm sure that's not that, they somehow morph into each other. There's got to be a bias in the selection process. You want something that reminds you of yourself. Right. I don't know if I look like my dog. That's going to lead into that thought now. But anyway,
is she with you? Can you lift her up?
Yes,
like,
can we do it side by side? You can tell me what you think. Yeah, I could, there's a style to his soul that he's got reflected in the physical objects of his environment. The Ray, 1 second, that the moment that I laughed the hardest at was the standoff with the money and the receipt. That's what happens when you've got a contrarian who's just oppositional and suspicious and kind of looking for fault, is you can't give him the money until he gives you the receipt, and you can't take the receipt until he, that was a great standoff.
I love that.
Ray.
Yeah, just in terms of cultivating your soul using Gogol, I guess there's two things I really get is just the sense of he just finds the world so interesting, and it's in just the details. Like he just feels like there's just something so much fun and peculiar and funny, and in just all of the way things are. And to the point where it's like a fantasy almost, where it has that, and I just love Shoshana pointing that out about, it's like oh yes, he's using this metaphor to describe his state of mind of like, oh, you wouldn't even notice, like, driving into another cart and oh, there's the cart, like, oh, the fantasy became a fact, and just like his metaphors, they just take on a life of their own that is just as real as the world around them. Just like the flies dancing or whatever.
Yeah.
Just to feel more about the world, that it has that incredibly imaginative, unexpected, curious texture to it. And just being able to do that in just little things, and just like, oh, I bet that little servant over there has a whole world of her own that's interesting in its own right.
Yeah, I'd like to connect two things from this week where I was conscious of Gogol's influence on me. One was I was talking to my office manager, and he was describing a student. A student walked by, and he said, his distinctive walk, and it's, since you don't know the student, it's going to be difficult to picture, but he sort of arches his head back, and kind of prances like all the time. That's just his walk. And then apparently at lunch the other day, he was carrying a Jell-O cup in his hand, like this, and walking in his characteristic fashion. And Tom, my office manager, looked at him and said, I don't know if it was to you, Grace, or to somebody else, but looked at him and said, he looks kind of like a tipsy socialite right now. And So he was just telling me this story, and I was thinking that was a very Gogol moment to observe that I hadn't even become conscious that he had this distinctive walk until Tom told me this story. Then I was both conscious of the distinctive walk. I could imagine the moment with the Jell-O cup, and it was a perfect very brief literary description of it. But so I told him at the time, I was like, I'm going to talk about that in my Gogol discussion group. It's just so perfect.
That was so Gogol.
That was so Gogol. But then it did make me conscious thereafter for the rest of the week of noticing when something, there's so much of life, and this, Ray, goes to the point you're making. There's so much of life where it kind of fades in and out. Like you get this brief awareness of it, and you can either let that awareness totally pass you by. Like there's something in it that goes, pay attention to this. And you can either let that pass by, or you can zero in on it and go, ooh, what was it that struck me about that? What was so interesting about it? And then you could make the effort to conceptualize it. And then it kind of stands out even more starkly. And it just seems like Gogol does that constantly. And with a real sense of benevolence, like that, there's this thing that attracts my attention, and he's thinking that delights me. What is it about it that
is so delightful?
So much? Yeah. So you could do that to a point of neurosis, but and maybe he did, but it is something I would like to develop in myself more, especially from the humorous. That seems like the distinctly Gogol-esque, whatever, I don't know what the adjective form is, quality is to find what's amusing about it, charming and amusing about it. That was one of my stories. Sorry for co-opting, but very quickly, the other one was a friend texted me and said, I am in the most insufferable hipster hotel that a client had put him in. It's completely miserable. I'm sitting here. He travels for work a lot, so he's sitting there by himself in this insufferable hotel, listening to the inane conversations around him, which he said is how he spends a lot of his time because he's always on the road. And I said, well, what Gogol would do is just sit there and like find what's entertaining and amusing in all of the details of this insufferable hotel. So again, it was like you could change your perspective. You could take the Flaubert perspective and say, this is why life is unlivable, and be very contemptuous and disdainful of, or you can take I'll find what's amusing about these people. Ray.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about Flaubert in this connection of if the hipster hotel is very Gogol-esque situation to be, then your situation of sitting next to the soccer moms or whatever that is like, oh, that's perfectly Flaubert. And I think about also just like one thing that's always fun to do is to ask what the characters of one book would think of the characters of another. And you can just see like the Flaubert people would just sort of look down on the Gogol people and think they're sort of outrageous and lower class and uncultivated. So boring and stodgy. Like I just have that image of what they're like interacting. But anyway.
Any other comments there, or we can go on to Plyushkin. Is that how I should say it? Okay.
That's how I pronounced it in my head. But
good. Okay.
I'm not an expert, so maybe.
All right. So, gosh, this is the one where I said it felt like it took a turn for a little while.
It did. I still enjoyed the presentation of the details, and it wasn't that I disliked the turn, but it was, I think, a very marked difference from the chapters.
I noticed it at first when he was describing the kind of overgrown foliage outside of the house, and it was described as beautiful even. And that seemed
sorry to interrupt. It
No,
even
go.
starts in the beginning of chapter 6 with like long
Yeah.
ago in the days of my youth, in the days
Yes.
of childhood. Like even just at the very beginning, it's like, oh, what?
Yeah. And what's interesting is the narrator is saying, in the days of my youth, I had the ability to be fascinated by and find what was interesting in every situation I encountered, which is precisely what Ray is saying Gogol is expert at doing. So
Right.
like the narrator is not Gogol's voice here, because it seems like Gogol is doing that throughout this whole book.
Right.
But the
Yeah.
narrator is lamenting the lost ability to take that perspective.
Do what he
on the
is in
world.
the process of doing.
Yeah. Well, to do what the book is doing.
Yeah.
So that was just interesting. So let's see.
I wondered if I even understood that correctly. It's Gogol talking, right? It's not.
No, it's the
supposed to be
narrator. The
Chichikov?
narrator has an identity. Because
Okay.
the narrator says at times, like, I'm not very good at talking about women, and
Right.
and
Yeah.
makes these sort of personal confessions. So it's sort of an unknown identity, but it's a person.
It's a person. Okay.
Yeah.
And then
so
we
I
go
would-
back to Chichikov.
So yeah, I wouldn't think of it as Gogol's voice. But yeah, it's an interesting narrator. So yeah, like, okay, there we came to this section that says, in short, it was all beautiful, as neither the work of nature nor that of art is alone, but as only happens when they work together, when nature's chisel gives the final touches to the often unintelligent, clumsy work of man, relieves the heavy masses, obliterates the crudely conceived symmetry, the bare gaps through which the plan is too nakedly apparent, and gives a marvelous warmth to all that has been created in the frigid stiffness of calculated neatness and accuracy. Now, this is the description of the home, the hoarder, the miserly hoarder's home that we're about to enter, and we're focused on something beautiful, and it's said in a very earnest way. So maybe that's what sets us up for sympathy for him. I don't know, but it felt so different from to me it felt very different from what we had read prior to that.
Yeah, it seems like this chapter like starts off with the description that I mentioned, and then goes into this description of the house, and it's just, it takes on this kind of like earnest quality that is, I mean, the rest, it's not that the rest of it isn't like earnest, it's just not.
Well, we're not focused on humor here, and there's like a sentimentality to it. Yeah.
Sentimentality. That's the word for it. And so then, yeah, I do think that kind of sets the tone for the meeting with
Plyushkin.
Thank you.
No.
I struggle. Yeah, I think it kind of sets the tone for the meeting with him, because then you do get this like kind of very sad and touching backstory for him. And not one whit of it makes you go ha 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 like the rest of the book has been doing. But then it is interesting how then the end of the chapter is so funny. It goes right back to the old tone. So I'm in awe of this. I do not understand how he's able to do it, but it works really well, and I really enjoyed it. Which is not a very insightful comment, but that's what I've got.
It is. Shoshana?
Just this back with, I'm still muted. Back with the idea that, still muted?
No, you're good. We can hear you.
Okay. Well, the idea of the narrator is trying to be conscientious. It's sort of as if the narrator is, I don't know, like say if you've been hired to be wait staff, and you know that you're supposed to go through all the specials. And so he says, okay, I'm supposed to go through all the specials, you know, as opposed to someone who is actually in the restaurant and understands how things work. So that's kind of what the narrator is doing sometimes. It's my job. I got to tell you about this. Oh, and I better tell you about that one too, without actually being an artist. That's when the narrator talks. But see, Gogol actually is an artist. And so sometimes it's as if he's escaping, the book is escaping from the clutches of the narrator who doesn't really know how to do things. And I think that that's part of what we're feeling here, that it does seem sincere and it's not funny. In fact, it's tragic because, you know, here's a human being living something of an empty, sad life and is not being treated with mockery per se, but rather, well, this is what it looks like, as if you're seeing it with fresh eyes. You know, this you'd see this, you'd see this, you'd see this, and it is shocking. So, and you figure, and we've just started. We haven't even, Chichikov hasn't even done his shtick, and how is he going to explain to this person something that he hasn't exactly explained to us? So I think there is something ominous about this. And yet I think when you said sentimental, that's on the mark, because it's as if in someone else's hands, this would be the time when, oh, here's our poor victim and we're going to feel sorry for him and we need a makeover. You know, we need someone to come in and rescue him, but instead what we've got is Chichikov, who's not going to rescue anybody.
No, he's just going to modify his pitch according to what he's observed and say, instead of praising him for being such a good manager, he's going to praise him for his economy or something. I forget exactly how it, but just changes the language to appeal to what he sees.
Yeah. Including, is he a man? Is he a woman? Is he the housekeeper? Is he the owner and so on? He's got to figure that stuff out.
Oh my gosh. I have to say, in terms of this, the enjoyment I get from the novel, the description of his hoard, of all the things he's hoarded over time, I could have read pages upon pages upon pages of that.
I love that too.
Just as an end in itself. The toothpick that he might have used before, what was the, oh shoot, what was the analogy? I don't know, but you get the sense that
before the invasion of Moscow by the French.
Right. So it's like 50 years have passed since that toothpick was used. So yeah, I just again, it's not that the tone again was not quite humorous in the same way, although it was a little bit funny. It was more delighting in the eccentricity of it all. And the facility for description of it. This was another thing that's close, but not quite the same that I described before. This is a weird thing to confess, but I was watching a Formula One race with my son, and one of the drivers was being interviewed. And I noticed that it appeared as if his top teeth were too large, like his jaw on the top was too large for his lower jaw. And it's just, again, a thing that kind of came into my awareness and passed through. And again, I had the moment of stopping and going, Gogol would have some way of describing that would be utterly entertaining and name precisely what it is that I'm observing. And I felt like that's a good impact for him to have on me, that I was conscious of noticing this thing and then wanting a way to describe it and thinking I'm incapable of I don't have the writer's capacity to describe this. So that's sort of how it felt with all of those objects around the room, is just his facility for describing things in a way that sort of highlights what's important about them in that moment. Who do we have next?
Great.
Okay. In terms of just the hoard part, basically he's been doing that the whole novel. Like every time you walk in somewhere, he has like some laundry list of things, and it's like those are always just such a delight. So, but in terms
here, there's a large number of
there's more than usual.
Yes.
But in terms of what and actually just all those little details are they're just marvelous. Just how he puts so much character into just like, just some pipe that's laying around or some toothpick, as we say. Like there's just so much life there. But rolling it back to the tone issue. I was actually sort of waiting for a shift of tone like this, where it suddenly gets more emotional and serious, at least on a certain level, where there's more pathos. I guess in part because of the overcoat, and just like that's just a book that has both very clearly, but also just because I just know he's always so concerned with what people are like underneath the surface, underneath like, oh, that's some person walking by. Well, no, they have a rich life of their own. I felt like that was going to happen at some point. And also in terms of the shift of tone for you guys, I actually feel it's still funny in a certain way. Like it's still humor tinged. As in just like talking about the his whole tragic backstory. The way I describe it is, I forget who exactly said. I think it was Nabokov describing the plays of Chekhov. That one problem with when Chekhov was putting on his plays is that the people who wanted to do them thought that they was a tragedy, and he said, no, it's a comedy. And the way Nabokov described it is it's the sort of comedy that's overlaying a tragedy. It's the way people admit like how much of a disaster their lives is, and isn't that quaint, how it fell apart. And that feels a bit like the tone here of, it is funny on a certain level. There's a certain absurdity about it, but people are really hurting underneath the surface.
Yeah.
It has a very, I guess.
What's interesting about that though is that, so with the overcoat, it's a single character that we're focused on, and we laugh at the humor of him, but then we get to see his soul underneath it as well. And with the other characters, it's been the humor on the surface of it, and now we get to this particular character and we still get the humor of it. I mean, there is plenty of humor. The whole conversation about the moldy cake, go get the cake and serve him some cake, but first cut the mold off the top of it, but don't throw the moldy bits away, give them to the chickens because we have to use the moldy bits too. I mean, that was hysterically funny. Or the whole exchange over the the fight with his servant over the piece of paper. And he was absolutely insistent that she had stolen the piece of paper, and every excuse she gave, he could come up with a reason why she would have stolen the piece of paper. I mean, there's so much humor, but there's this pathos underneath it too. But it's just interesting that it's with this character in particular, not the previous characters.
Well, I feel like in part it's, because he's a real dead soul. He's actual, and it's I have to say, like, it's probably the best line for me of the book so far is just when he says that death is more merciful than old age. And it was just like, at least when you die, you get a tombstone that says, here, rest in peace. And like, you don't even get that when you're old, when your souls become so decrepit, and broken in that horrible, and it just those moments of like there's this like flicker of emotion of like, oh, my old, we used to be friends in school, the superintendent and I, whoever it was. And it's like, but it's like, no, it wasn't even a feeling. It was a sort of a flicker of a feeling. And then the deadness sets in again.
Well, since you bring that up, I have to read this because it is arguably my favorite serious passage of the entire book. But also, so that's interesting though. It's like he's now come to a character where the humor can't be dominant because it's too tragic, and I guess that's the idea. But it's still a shift. So it's a new experience, different from the encounters with the previous characters. But that line that you were just referring to absolutely floored me. In terms of a description of a soul that's dead. An expression, not a feeling, but of a sort of pale reflection of feeling. It was this is one of those moments of stopping, going, okay, I noticed a feeling sort of flicker across his face, but then it's gone forever. And it wasn't really even much of a feeling at all. And Gogol thinks to himself, what is that like? It was an apparition, like the sudden appearance of a drowned man at the surface of the water, that calls forth a shout of joy in the crowd upon the bank. But in vain, the rejoicing brothers and sisters let down a cord from the bank and wait for another glimpse of the back or the arms exhausted with struggling. That appearance was the last. All is still, and the unrippled surface of the implacable element is still more terrible and desolate than before. So the face of Plyushkin after the feeling that glided for an instant over it, looked harder and meaner than ever. That is chilling, brilliant, powerful, absolutely amazing, and definitely evokes profound sympathy.
Yeah, actually, I have to say about that is it's sort of I forget what you said, I think last time. He's quoting somebody that they're very clear characters, almost to the point of caricature, but they're also real. And like, here's a character, and one thing about caricatures is you don't think of them as having like inner souls.
Yeah.
You know, like they're just like, oh, isn't that funny, that old woman who's just, you know, so miserly or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But here it's like, well, this is a man who is an actual character in a sense of his inner life is gone. You know, his feeling capacity is gone, and that's really tragic. It's sad that he's a caricature.
I feel a little bit guilty making this comparison, but that is the appeal of The Office, is that the characters are comedic and caricature-like on the surface, but they're all given something that's kind of endearing and sympathetic at the same time. And I think that is part of what's unique about that show in relation to other comedies. But apologies, Gogol, for making a comparison. All right, Wendy.
I had a question. So the quote that you read to say how it kind of gave this description that was more beautiful, that was confusing to me. Is that at the beginning of chapter 6?
That is in my book, it's on page 127. It was just after the moment Ray mentioned where Plyushkin thinks they're trying to think of someone he knows.
Okay.
That he'd have to go into town and complete the purchase. How can I leave the house? And he's like, haven't you someone of your acquaintance? And he has this flash of memory of an acquaintance of his. And it's like bringing back the past when he used to have emotions. And there's a flicker of one across his face, but then it goes away and is dead and leaves him harder and meaner than before.
Okay, I'll have to look there because I was thinking of it as the introduction of Plyushkin and his home and everything. And I was like, wow, that's not in my head at all. Cause it's the rough boards and the roofs without,
this
that are
is
just
after we get
framing.
the backstory, and after, like, it's basically after we learn how he became the soulless miser that he is now, after we hear that whole backstory, then we get a little more insight into him.
Yeah, it's strange because I didn't have much of a sympathetic reaction to him at all. It was much more focused on the misery that he has perpetrated on the people who are dependent on him. And I mean,
a lot of them are dead.
Yeah, dead, or they've fled to get away from this horrible person who, and that's my just synopsis of him, is that he believes the worst of everyone around him. Everyone is trying to steal all the time. And he lives miserably, and he's just infected everything and everyone around him. So I mean, I also did the quote, about like the drowning person, and that there was some glimmer of feeling.
I don't mean to I think you're supposed to be repulsed by the character that's presented to you. He's, like I said, that image of the snuff coming out of his nose. I'll just read that real quick so that not observing in his delight. So he's delighted. This is a moment of delight in him because he's going to sell off these souls. Not observing that a piece of snuff of the color of coffee grounds was peeping out of his nose in a most unpicturesque way. I don't know what a picturesque way would be. And that the skirts of his dressing gown had grown apart and were displaying undergarments not at all suitable for exhibition. I mean, that is a grotesque, repulsive character. So this, I don't mean sympathy. It's almost the tragedy of having become a character like that. So I don't mean like, oh, poor Plyushkin. I mean, look at the horror of becoming such an empty-souled, miserly, suspicious, nasty, like grotesque kind of man.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it.
Yeah, I think, and that in this case, I can relate to someone who has tried to cheat other people and lie to other people. They know that this is their character, and actually, as they get older, it's like people become more so. And it's to this extent where it colors that they think they really do genuinely think that everyone around them would try to cheat and steal because they know that is their own soul. So they really genuinely see that in everyone around them. And it is really sad.
Yeah, I don't want to be unfair to Dickens, but you thought, this character is compared to Ebenezer Scrooge, like that Ebenezer Scrooge has nothing. This is a true miser through and through to every fiber of his being. And that the number of ways, I mean, it describes him as a mere tatter of humanity was one of the phrases I wrote down. There's no humanity left in him. It's all dead. There's no emotion, no humanity, no human sympathy, everything. I loved the description of him carrying the money as if it were water that might spill out of his hands. I could see that completely, of like everything is focused on this is what life is all about and nothing else. Joseph, who do we have next?
Next is Shoshana, then Molly.
Okay.
Okay, I think that what we're all noticing is that there's a difference with this character, and there are kind of different ways to describe it. But one aspect is that if you think of the other characters, it looks as if their flaws are a matter of character, and with him, it seems to be almost more mental illness, which is not the same thing. And as if this man couldn't fix himself without some help. And that's part of the tragedy, that he's not just absurd and he's not just someone who's got problems, but that he's beyond. And I think that's one reason why that image of the castaway is powerful, because it's as if his humanity is like a castaway that you can't get back. But it also gives us the image of human beings want the castaway to be rescued and are disappointed when it doesn't happen. And that reminded me of something which is actually, I don't think it's likely to be in Gogol's mind, but I think it's maybe could be our mind. You know a poem called The Castaway by it's by William Cowper, Cowper. And if you look it up, you see it's quite a powerful poem. And in it, he talks about, the image of you're on a ship and someone is overboard and we can't save him. And he knows that we would save him if we could, but we've got to keep going. He's snatched from all effectual aid. He's, I actually pulled it up. He feels his strength decline, and he shouted, and his friends would save him, but they can't. Okay. And then at length, he's going to sink beneath. And then the poet at the end says, I see a parallel to my own life. Okay. And no voice divine, this is the last bit. No voice divine the storm allayed, no light propitious shone. When snatched from all effectual aid, we perished each alone. But I beneath a rougher sea and whelmed in deeper gulfs than he. And Cooper had mental illness. So
Chill.
it's
Yeah.
chilling. Yeah. And
Yeah.
actually, it's quoted into The Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, where it also has resonance. So I think that may be sort of an image that became something that people knew and talked, without necessarily knowing it as a literary thing. The idea of
Well, there's the
sinking into the water.
Man overboard in Les Miserables
Yeah.
also.
Yeah. It just sort of the idea of you can see him, but you can't get him. And and the person wasn't thrown overboard. It's sort of, you can't fight against it. And that's what for Cooper, mental illness felt like. You're drowning in it. And I think there's something like that with Plyushkin, that he can't, I don't know if we could get that man some therapy and that would help, but it doesn't look as if he can just pull himself out of it.
No, it is a disease now.
It is now.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's sinking.
Yeah.
That's it. It's a great poem, by the way.
I'll look it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Oh gosh, well, we're running out of time. I did want to mention the image of his eyes like mice darting from their holes. That was, does everybody recall that description? It set you, this was the kind of conflict in his character, that there were the elements where it's described as tragic, and then there are the elements where he's just sort of grotesque, and his little eyes were not dim with age, but darted about under their overhanging brows like mice when poking their sharp noses out of their dark holes, pricking up their ears and twitching their whiskers. They peep out to see whether the cat or mischievous boy is lying in ambush, and sniff the very air with suspicion. So that's his eye. That metaphor of his eyes captures how he just regards his fellow human beings generally.
I'm interrupting, but my professor years ago called that a runaway metaphor. And I think that's what Gogol does. He's stuck, and then off it goes. Yeah.
He indulges in runaway metaphors.
Yeah.
Molly and Mary-Elaine, did you still have something to say?
You and Shoshana scooped me.
Okay.
I pointed out the exact thing of the man overboard.
Oh, okay.
Back at 2, as you will see in the chat. But yeah, that overboard was such a powerful image that I immediately thought of that. That was my favorite chapter of the Les Mis. So whenever I see anything that remotely resembles a man overboard, that's where I go to. But I really felt badly for Plyushkin. I know he's gross and repulsive, but I was just really moved by his state, that he's so suspicious and so unsavable and so divorced from the ship of humanity.
Oh, just
that
the image.
whole chapter just got to me as
the
hopelessness feel.
It just feels tragic to see a man living in that condition, because it is one of such misery. So the image of him bouncing his grandchildren on his knee and then keeping the dressing gown his daughter gave him and then sending her away with nothing.
Yeah.
Like there's life there that you could have, and you're just turning it away.
He just wants it. I think that's part of why he saves these things, is like he's saving the unessential parts and rejecting the essential, but he doesn't really know the difference anymore. And that's what separates him, and that's what's tragic. So,
yeah. Mary-Elaine?
I just wondered, I see Shoshana's holding the P&B translation. If we had time for her to make a comment or two about the differences between the Garnet translation and the P&B, whether they're significant.
Well, I thought that it was a little more idiomatic, and the characters sound more different from each other. But I haven't studied all the translations that there are, and some people are critical of Bavarian Volokonsky. I mean, there was a time when they took over, and then other people don't like their Chekhov and so on. But I guess for me, things are, whereas sometimes Garnett would use the same word for two different Russian words, they are more likely to give you different words.
Nuances, yeah.
Yeah, and like the cucumbers, pickled brine. But I haven't made a study of all the translations. This just happens to be one that it looks as if I must have taught from it a long time ago because there are notes in there. But what I think actually happened was that I prepared to teach it and the class got canceled because there aren't that many notes. And I've got no memory of my students reacting. So I think that this was going to be my teaching copy, and then the class got canceled. So I must have picked it, as one that I liked, but I don't think I taught it. I do like their translations of Dostoevsky, although there are quite a few competitions translations out there now. But I think they do a good job. I think they did a very nice job with Anna Karenina. And you know how they work, right? They're a married couple, and she knows Russian.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, she knows Russian and he knows English. So, and they're married. Hope they stay married. This is good because they work together to give us translations that'll be accurate and true to and sound like English. So that's
I love that. I love them as an inspiration because I'm working with a young man named Antoine to translate François Hernani, and it has been complete joy to work with him because he understands. He's a native French speaker and he understands all the nuances of the poem, so he makes those clear to me. And sometimes he needs both an ability to interpret poetry and knowledge of French, and there's so many times that it's been kind of a revelation to me what he's made clear needs to be translated, and then I try to translate it into passably beautiful English. I'm not at all trying to rival Rostand's poetic expression, but I'm just trying to capture the language. And it's been so much of a thrill that I've decided this is one of my lifetime vocations. Good thing he's a really young man. I'm going to be translating Rostand for the rest of my life. So I already know what's next after this one. And then I think there's an unlimited store of opportunities beyond that. It's so much fun. It's one of those things that I know I've hit upon something that I truly love because I become absolutely obsessive about it. We'll review a few some segment of it and then have a meeting on the books for 4 days later. And I'll say, okay, I'm going to do my best to have this section done 4 days later, and then it'll be done the next morning because I can't think about anything else. So that's when you know you found something you really love to do. Ray.
Just quickly because we're at the end, but I just in terms of sympathy being out of control, I think the direct comparison is with Peter Keating. There's a character that we have like a certain feeling of sympathy for, and like, why'd you screw it all up? Like you could have had a better life for yourself, and we feel bad that you messed it up so badly. And I think with Gogol, I'm not quite sure what his attitude towards volition and control of your own life is exactly, but there's a sense of he didn't have to be that way, of like, hey, young men, this is a warning to you. You can do something different than be this dead soul.
Yeah. All right. So for next week, chapters 7, 8, and 9. And really excited to see what's in store. See everyone next week.